Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and today we are coming with another Pathfinder 2E build for the fighter remastered. As there is, I know there are some classes that have not gotten builds yet, but I figured since the remaster is out, I will make builds first for the classes that got remastered, just so people have a frame of reference when they're looking stuff up, especially because the remaster is kind of a big thing. And today we're going to be talking about the Zen Warrior. The Zen Warrior is a meshing of the fighter and monk classes. It's a pretty obvious concept. But one of the things I really enjoyed about this particular build is it combines actually the best elements of both monk and fighter. And on top of that, you get a particular build that is designed to be really effective in combat, whether it is doing damage or whether it's aiding your team. As the core function of this build is to give fighter access to special monk weapons that they can utilize incredibly well with their higher weapon proficiency. And it gives you a chance to utilize the advanced weapons that monks have to do a little bit extra work to get access to. So that being the case, let's go ahead and get on to the build. So starting off, let's talk about what attribute modifiers we're going for. What's our core ability scores that we're going for? First, we're going to start off with strength. This is a build that is very predominantly using athletics as one of its core features and striking. And not only that, but it will allow us to use heavy armor, as we could go the finesse dex fighter way to do this build. And I do think that's pretty legitimate, but because we're using athletics heavily, we might as well just double down on strength. And it allows us to wear heavy armor rather than trying to force using unarmored stuff, which can be a bit more tedious in the game, especially if you're not just 100% investing in your decks. Next up is going to be Con, and that's because we're going to be a frontline character on like in the midst of the enemies. We're going to be in close range. That's where we're going to operate at our best. So that being the case, this is just a very obvious stat to pick up. And honestly, for our third stat, it's going to be charisma, and that's only because using intimidation is actually going to be very beneficial for the style of play that we're going for. And I'll kind of get a little bit more into that here in actually just a moment, because let's move on to the skills. So I've kind of already mentioned this a bunch, but the primary skill we're going to be focusing on whenever we get a skill increase and whenever we can is athletics. And that's because the weapon that this build is focused on, which is going to be the hook sword, has the trip trait. So using the trip trait in addition to item bonus that we're going to have on our weapon is going to be a very substantial way that we're going to efficiently be able to trip enemies during combat. Now, the other skill proficiency I'm going to recommend is Intimidation. And Intimidation is one I mentioned because when you intimidate a foe and they get the frightened condition, not only are there a lot of interesting different feats and ancestries that can play around this, so it's very fun to utilize, but it also reduces the enemy's saves. And when you reduce their saves, you also reduce their save DCs. So if we were to, for instance, frighten and then trip the enemy, well, then their reflex DC is going to be reduced, making it easier for us to trip and possibly crit trip the enemy. So these are the two primary stats. I don't really have anything else beyond that. Do whatever suits your build, whatever you style up for your character. These are just the two primary ones, and even then, mostly athletics. Intimidation is just kind of an additional thing to consider for your turn. Now, before we get really into it, obviously we're starting off as a fighter because we want the higher weapon proficiency. And I know you don't get it until level 5, but at level 5, when we get our weapon mastery, we're going to select swords because we're going to be using the hook sword, and it is a sword. So our primary weapon we're going to be using for this build are swords, but there are a plethora of other monk weapons that can be utilized in very interesting ways. And many of them are like in the club or in the polearm groups. So there are some other options, but for this build specifically, we're going to be using swords. Beyond all that, let's go ahead and get into the feats. So starting out at level 1, because we're a fighter, we're going to be picking up Double Slice. This makes sense. The hook swords is a twin weapon, so That being the case, utilizing 2 weapons not only is going to be effective as far as the fact that we're already dual wielding, but with the twin trait, we're going to be dealing extra damage whenever we use our twin slice. Or double slice, my bad. So that being the case, this is going to be a very, very easy, like, attack with both weapons as much as possible build for all intents and purposes, not including, various circumstances. So double slice is a very easy pickup. At level 2, we're going to get right into it. We're going to pick up the Monk Multiclass Archetype, and this is going to give us the Strong Fist feature, which allows us to, if we need to, fight unarmed when necessary. Other than that, the initial dedication doesn't really offer us too much more that we need to really worry about. So that being the case, it's just a prerequisite for what we're selecting next level, which at level 4, we're going to be selecting the basic Kata multi-class archetype feat, which is going to give us Monastic Weaponry. This gives us access to monk weapons, which, depending on how your game is run, might not be super relevant. It's something that, like, access is predominantly a Pathfinder Society thing, but it's something I use in my games just because it makes certain player choices have more value. So this will give us access to the hook swords that we can now utilize. And the best part about this is whenever we're using a monk feature that specifies unarmed strikes, it also counts for monastic weapons, which is going to be actually a huge part of the build. So that being the case, this is a necessary feat moving forward. Now, at level 6 is when we're actually going to be able to use the hook swords, because at level 4, when we selected monastic weaponry, unfortunately, because they're advanced weapons, we're not going to have immediate access to them. So in order to get our higher proficiency, we're actually going to need to take from the fighter feats this time, the advanced weapon training. This gives us the ability to use the hook swords at our maximum proficiency, which obviously is a really good thing. And this is actually a kind of a big thing in general. So advanced weapons, if you're unaware, the biggest thing that they typically get are more traits. And while I'll talk about the hook swords a little bit later in the gear section of this guide, the hook swords have the twin trait, which means that when we attack with both weapons, we add additional damage equal to the number of weapon damage dice that we're dealing. And it also has the parry trait. So if we parry with the weapon, we get a bonus to our AC. And in addition to that, it has the trip and disarm traits, meaning that we add our weapon item bonus to those maneuvers, and we can use them without needing an open hand. So overall, it's a really good weapon. It does do a D6, which is not the most, but for dual wielding, that's honestly one of the best types of damages you can get. I do think there are some dual wielding weapons you can do that are D8s, but with the a bunch of extra features that we're getting from the hook swords, the hook swords are honestly one of the best weapons for this particular playstyle. Now, at level 8, we're going to get Twin Parry, and the biggest benefit of this is when we're dual wielding weapons, we can set up a parry. It's essentially the ray shield action, and rather than increasing our AC by 1, because these weapons have the parry trait, we're actually going to be able to increase our AC by 2. So, that being the case, we essentially get to wield 2 weapons and a shield equivalently, though we can't shield block with it, which is not really a big deal, honestly, for this build. And this just increases our particular fighter's ability to avoid getting crit and to avoid taking some damage, which is pretty good. It's overall a build that works very, very well. It all centers on weapons, and the fighter is a class that very much centers on fighting, so an entire build that focuses around the use of particular weapons fits in like a glove. So overall, this build is already really good. At level 8, you're already underway, and the build will just get better and better. In fact, this build pretty much takes off at level 6. Like, level 6 is the minimum you need to get, which is unfortunate, but honestly, most builds in the game don't take off till at minimum level 5 anyway. So being able to say that this build is pretty good to go at level 6 is great. And at level 8, we increase our defense, making ourselves even more difficult to deal with on the battlefield, in addition to the fact that we're dealing a bunch of damage, and in addition to the fact that we can just boost our AC if we feel the need to. Now, at level 10, we're going to be selecting Monk's Flurry from the Multiclass Archetype. This is for a particular reason. Now, Fighter already does have access to a feat that allows you to strike twice with 2 weapons for a singular action, but Monk's Flurry is different because it gives us access to Flurry of Blows, and because of Monastic Weaponry, we can use our weapon strikes with Flurry of Blows, and in addition to that, there's so many feats that affect Flurry of Blows specifically. So this is actually another mandatory pick, and this does allow us to very easily attack 4 times during our turn. You can attack twice at your, well, one at your highest proficiency, and then the next one at -2, because these are not agile weapons, and then 2 more times at the 3rd multi-attack penalty, which is not super great to do, but we can do it. And if you just have nothing to do other than just strike the enemy a bunch of times, well, then it's actually not a bad course of action. Though I do recommend, if you're playing this style, and I'll get into this a little bit later as well, your main focus should be either dealing damage when opportunity is there, or setting your team up for success using the trip feature with your weapon. You can trip with your weapon right away, and then you can then lay into the enemy using your double slice, which is probably going to be your best method, or there's a variety of other different combinations as well. Like, so I'll get into this a little bit later. The biggest thing you need to know, though, is your fighter is either setting stuff up or dealing the damage, which I think a lot of people really enjoy. All right, level 12, we're dipping, well, I guess more into Monk, not back into Monk. We're picking up Advanced Kata, and this time we're taking up Key Strike. Now, this is actually a massive bonus for our character because it gives us a focus point, which we don't normally have, to use the Key Strike spell, which for a singular action, we can make a single strike or a flurry of blows, normally unarmed, but because we have monastic weaponry, we can do this with our hook swords. And we get a +1 status bonus to our hits, and we deal an additional 2d6 damage at this level, which is pretty insane. And at level 17, we'll be able to do an additional 3d6 damage for each of our 2 strikes with our hook swords. This is going to be our major bread and butter, but it is unfortunate because we only have 1 key point. So up until next for level 14, that is, we're going to only be able to do this once per combat. That's not bad, and it does give us a really good opportunity to dump a bunch of damage. And in addition, it gives us a +1 status bonus to our strikes, which means that as a fighter, our crit chance is even higher, and we're doing extra damage. Like, this just makes utter sense. This is a really good damage feat that increases our damage so much just from this one pickup. It's really, and it's a level 1 monk feat, which is pretty insane that a level 1 feat can have this much impact. At level 14, we're going to be picking up Wholeness of Body. Now, the main reason for this mostly is just it's another key spell, which means we get another focus point, and this actually does give us the ability to, I believe, it's a level 2 focus spell, and every level above that we get 8 HP, which at the time of selecting this, we have 7th level spells. So this gives us 48 HP when we use it, if we decide to use it, or the ability to counteract a poison or a disease, I believe, in our character, if that's something that's currently negatively affecting us, which there's a lot of actual like diseases or poisons that make you sickened for as long as you have the disease. So this is actually a good way to get rid of one of the worst conditions in the game. But it's also a massive 48 HP when we need it. But more importantly, we have 2 focus points, so now we can do our key strike multiple times. So that's something that's the biggest part of it. And honestly, it just makes our fighter, again, more sturdy and have the ability to now get rid of certain inflictions that we can get during a fight. So this just fits in naturally with the build. It does technically increase our power as well. And yeah, this is a blending. There's not necessarily an even amount of monk and fighter feats, but this does offer a good amount of both worlds. As at level 16, we're going to pick up Twin Defense. Now, the biggest part about Twin Defense that is really good is it allows us to be in our parry stance essentially all the time. So it's a stance we spend a single action to get into, and now we're benefiting from our twinned parry for the rest of the combat. So our AC now just permanently +2 without any additional action spending. That's a really good feature, and it makes our fighter, yet again, harder to kill on the battlefield. Now, level 18, I went with Savage Critical, and the biggest reason behind this is, well, if you're just going to sit there and attack a bunch of times anyway, and you roll a 19, and it's like on your third attack, penalty, which means you're not probably going to crit anyway, it's actually not that bad. The sheer number of attacks that we're doing in this build, I mean, if it's our first strike, even our second strike, a 19 is probably still going to net a crit anyway. But in the few cases that it doesn't, against a boss or something like that, it's not that bad. The biggest benefit to this one is if we're using our Flurry of Blows for the last two attacks, well, then we have at least a chance to net a critical, because even at -10, we're a fighter, and we're still likely to do a hit at the very least. So yeah, it's actually not terrible. There's other feats you could select, and if you swap out, I completely understand. But for this particular build that does have a higher emphasis on just multiple attacks, I don't think it's a very bad choice. And at level 20, I kind of just stack on this by taking Weapon Supremacy, giving us a quick action to make another strike. So that being the case, we can now attack 5 times around a lot easier. And because we're a fighter, if it's it's like level 20 at this point, we're probably going to be dealing a lot of damage with the build. So that being the case, these are the main feats. And for those who watched these videos before, I give you just the basic like vanilla rules, nothing changed. You could probably take these into society play. It depends on access and how that works for your build. But obviously, I use the bonus variant rule for free archetype all the time, so I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But let's go ahead and talk about the gear first. So let's look at the actual hook sword. So the hook sword is a monk weapon that has disarm, parry, trip, and twin. This is a very good, especially because now disarm has been vastly improved. The enemy needing to spend an action to readjust their grip to make it so they don't have a penalty to their attacks or their damage anymore. This is a pretty decent trait that we can use to make an enemy less effective, or we can trip them, probably triggering our attack or our reactive strike as they need to stand up if they want to, not be in a terrible state. So this is a really good weapon overall. Now it does do d6 and it only does slashing damage, but honestly, it's not that terrible. And with, like I said, the use of key strike in the build, we're going to be dealing tons and tons of damage throughout the build. In fact, one thing I would really mention is picking up a set of doubling rings. Doubling rings are very good because they allow you to pass on the runes from one weapon to the other weapon when you're dual wielding. Obviously, this is a dual wield build, so this actually saves your character money by making it so that you don't need to spend a whole nother set of both fundamental runes and property runes when we get the greater doubling rings, which are the ones I'm definitely going to recommend. But you can get the normal doubling runes as early as level 3. So the second you start upgrading your weapons already, you're already like bam, doubled up on the amount of benefit you're getting. It can save you a lot of money, and there is a lot of value to having different sets of runes on each of the two weapons. But the doubling runes I like particularly because it saves you a bunch of money that you could be spending elsewhere. And more importantly, when you're getting to the end game where rune costs are going up to the tens of thousands of gold, this is just a good way to have two weapons at the highest echelon without spending like a fortune. So that being the case, the doubling rings are something I'm going to highly, highly recommend. And let's go ahead and talk about some of the property runes I recommend for the build. Oh, and actually, I totally just forgot. Before I get to the weapon runes, let me talk about combat flexibility and improved flexibility. These are two additional fighter features that allow you to gain extra feats. They do need to be fighter feats specifically. And the reason why I thought of it now is combat flexibility allows us to take extra feats. Now, I'm not necessarily going to say that these are your choices that you need to take every single time. The whole point is that it's a free feat slot that you can swap every day. But one I'm going to recommend is Shatter Defenses. Shatter Defenses is a really good for combat flexibility because it allows you to benefit from an enemy who is in the frightened condition, making them off guard until you until they reduce their frightened condition. So that being the case, this is where the Fearsome rune really comes in handy, because with the Fearsome rune, on a crit, we can make the enemy frightened, and then we can do Shatter Defenses on an enemy to ensure that we don't even need to trip the enemy at this point. They're just going to be off guard until the end of their next turn, which is pretty solid. Now, for improved combat flexibility, I'm actually going to recommend Opening Stance. This is just a really simple one because it just makes our first turn more efficient, because we don't need to spend an action getting into our Twin's defense stance. So, this is one that I would select just because it makes our combat more efficient, and we don't even need to worry. Our characters just consider having higher AC after their first turn of combat, which is really good without any extra actions. It's a very solid choice, but like I said, the whole point of this particular feature is for you to select feats that benefit how you play. So that being the case, I really recommend these two feats in particular, but choose as the situation demands, as that's the whole point of flexibility. So back to runes. I already just mentioned the Fearsome rune. This allows us on a crit to give the enemy the frightened condition, and we're a fighter, we're more likely to crit anyway. So honestly, fighter's probably the only class that really benefits this rune the most, as we just have the higher crit chance here. Now, the next one I'm going to recommend is the Wounding rune. It's a very obvious pick, but we slash the enemy, and if they can bleed, they will start bleeding, just increasing our overall damage. And with the sheer number of strikes we can do, and if we're surrounded by enemies, we can dish out bleeding incredibly fast. So that being the case, it's definitely one I'm going to recommend. But funny enough, there is an additional rune here, and it's specifically for use with Flurry of Blows. And that is going to be the Flurrying rune. The Flurrying rune is insanely cool because if you were to knock an enemy out with your first strike of your Flurry of Blows, you can actually then use your second strike against another enemy up to 30 feet away if there's no one else within range. This honestly solves one of the fighter's biggest problems, which is over damage, which, if you didn't know, is when a fighter does so much damage that they actually end up wasting damage because they overkill an enemy, which isn't helpful for the combat. So in this situation, this is just one of the really cool runes that was added in Treasure Vault that I absolutely love. And in addition, as another cool feature, we can once per day use a spiritual weapon, and rather than using your spell DC, since we do technically have one with our monk features, you don't actually use your spell like attack or DC. Instead, you use our own attack bonus when doing so. Though we do use wisdom instead of strength when it comes to damage. So it's less effective, but for a single sustain action. And also, in addition, we can use that single sustain to flurry with the spiritual weapon, which I don't, it might actually, 1 second. Okay, first of all, I got this wrong. I was reading the benefits of the Flurrying rune, which is not necessarily up to the remaster yet. It's Spiritual Armament is now the spell being used, and it does apply to our multi-attack penalty, sadly, but you can use your Flurry of Blows with this particular casting of the spell, which is really, really cool. In fact, it's something that's so interesting because it gives us the opportunity to make attacks against targets that are normally outside of our range. Because the spell has a 120-foot range, this can be used against flying creatures. This allows us to essentially attack as a ranged weapon, granted only for one combat once per day, and it does require a sustained action. Regardless, this is an insanely powerful rune, and definitely one I recommend picking up as soon as possible. So moving on to archetypes. If you're using the free archetype variant rule, obviously then we have a lot more feat slots to make use of. So I'm just going to recommend some of the interesting archetypes that you can add to this build. Obviously, of course, if you really wanted to, you could make your build a split 100% between fighter and monk and just use all your bonus archetype slots for your monk feats, which is definitely possible. But I'm going to recommend some archetypes because the build works as is. So that being the case, I'm going to go ahead and recommend some of my personal choices. So first is Butterfly Sword, or Butterfly Blade specifically. This one uses the Butterfly Swords, which is another advanced sword that is more if you want to go the Dex style fighter build. if you want to go full monk with like no armor and everything like that. They're a really good weapon. They don't have necessarily the same features, but they are agile, which means that if you want to go the much more just like buzzsaw cutting through enemies as much as possible, this is probably the way to go. Also, the archetype has just a lot of really cool like out of combat feats in addition, as the butterfly blades are an assassin like police group, which is very, very cool. So it's one that I recommend because one, it has benefits for the particular build, but two, it adds a very interesting flair to the character while still maintaining the level of what the build is about. Next is a very obvious one. It's going to be the dual weapon warrior. It's definitely one that just gives us more feats for using two weapons, and it can even relieve some of the feats that we have from fighter, allowing us to select some other fighter feats, as there's really no shortage of good feats in fighter. We can take like twin riposte, which allows us to, attack an enemy as a reaction when they critically miss us, and considering that we're going to have such a high AC anyway, it's honestly a really good choice. So that being the case, it's a very obvious one and one I'm going to highly recommend. The last one is actually a very interesting one, and I picked the blessed one. The main reason why I selected this one is, in particular, I would like to get more focus points into this build, and actually getting focus points earlier. I mean, there's a way where you could select the key strike earlier, especially with how some of these kind of things set up, that this is particularly a good one because not only does it give us some more, like one more focus point, but it also gives our character a lot of utility as a healer. Wholeness of body, while really good, only works for yourself. Blessed one allows us to use this feature outside of it, and in fact, then we don't even need to select wholeness of body because a lot of those features we get from blessed one, and we can share that with our allies. So this is a very good support archetype that you can use in addition with the build to make your character even better. You're helpful in so many situations. You're setting your team up, you're dealing tons of damage, and you're healing your team, probably potentially even as the main healer. It's really good. It makes the build super flexible, actually. And actually, this reminds me of so here is how I would use this build particularly. So you start up in combat, depending on what level on you get into your twin defense stance, you run into the enemies, and then you start setting your team up. You can trip with your weapon, obviously, and then you can go into a flurry of blows if you used your stance or if you had to move, obviously. Or you just run up and trip an enemy. Then your team gets the ability to do some stuff, or you run in and do some damage with your key strike if you want to do a big damage up. Now, when you're face to face with an enemy, something I really recommend is using Demoralize, using our high intimidation, to attempt to get the frightened condition on the enemy. We can demoralize, move that into a trip, which then puts the enemy prone on the ground. They're suffering a -3 to their AC, one from status from frightened, or potentially two, depending on if you crit or not, and then two from being prone as a circumstance penalty. Then we can key strike, and even though it will be at our second and third multi-attack penalties, with the status bonus from key strike kind of mitigating some of the accuracy loss, and if we're at high level, we have the critical savagery. Savage critical, my bad. Then we'll be able to drumbeat that enemy into the ground and probably leave them a bloody mess. And not only that, but now for the rest of our team, the frightened condition, and oh yeah, also because they're frightened, they're easier to trip. But our spellcasters in the team are better likely to affect that enemy as well because they're frightened, reducing their saves. And our other teammates are also benefiting from an enemy with -3 to their AC. So overall, a very devastating combo. And because we're so like almost bulletproof on the battlefield, high AC, so we're less likely to be crit. And even when we're a crit, I mean, like I said, by the time we pick up wholeness of body, bam, one action, you get 48 HP back, which is a good amount of HP. And you can still double slice like after that if you absolutely wanted to. And if we have enemies that have high like resistance to physical damage, double slice is really good because we make both attacks and we apply them simultaneously so that any resistances are only applied once to both of our damage. also really, really good. And if we ever get our weapon like made of silver or anything that enemies have a weakness to, well, Flurry of Blows can proc that weakness multiple times. So you can see where this build really is. We're up on the front of the battlefield. We have high AC. We're probably wearing heavy armor because why not? We're a fighter and we have high strength, right? And we have increased defense. We have healing methods. We can make the enemy super weak with our maneuvers, or we can just drum beat them with both of our weapons, dealing tons and tons of damage. It's a very good all-rounder build, and I actually thoroughly enjoy this build because of that. So at the end of this video, like I typically do, I recommend some Ancestries. This one was a harder choice, mostly because a lot of my Ancestry choices either rely on like the use of certain ancestral weapons, which there is a feat in Monk that allows us to use our ancestral weapons and treat them as monk weapons. So that's another possible avenue. But the hook swords are really, really good. And I struggled to find a ancestry weapon that we could dual wield and use a lot of the feats in this build that worked in the build as well. So instead, I chose to select the android is actually my first choice. And that's because Nanite Surge is really cool. It allows us to get a bonus on our next skill check, which is really solid. And you can do it like once per day or something like that. It's just really good. Android has a lot of really good features that further amps what we already can do. And I think they also have like a healing like nanite feature as well. So it increases our durability. It's just a very solid ancestry altogether. And the other one is the Vanara. And the Vanara I selected because they have a lot of monk weapons in their ancestry weapons already. So this allows you to start the game potentially using monk weapons that you would like to use. And in addition to that, they have some very interesting weapons that they have access to as well. And of course, it has the Monkey King kind of theme to it. So I'm sure there's a dual like staff build you can do using the Vanara and this particular setup, which I think is super interesting. So that being the case, these are my two choices. Hopefully you all enjoyed the build. I actually really like this one. I think it makes fighter much more interesting, much more than focusing on just like how much damage I can do in a round. We can do a lot. We can be the multi-use tool for our team for everything other than standard like traversal or investigation stuff. If it's combat related or healing related, this build is really solid. But, obviously it needs a solid team to work. That's just how Pathfinder goes. So, yeah, this is a good one for teamwork use as well. I like it. Anyway, let me know your thoughts about the video down below in the comments section. If you like this video, please give it a like so that other people have a higher chance of seeing it, and subscribe as we're getting back into the swing of things here on the channel. I'm going to be trying to get a Pathfinder build out every week. So if you want to see new builds for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, this is the channel to be on. But that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.